Welcome everybody to our webinar for this afternoon from the Zehr Institute for Restorative Justice at Eastern Mennonite University's Center for Justice and Peacebuilding. My name is Brian Gum and I'm a technical support person for these webinars. And so what I'm going to do here is just give a little bit of an intro to how to interact with our speaker and host today. And then I'll turn things over to the host, Carl Stauffer. The way to ask questions and engage in discussion throughout the course of this webinar is by clicking the Q&A button, which is located in the bottom right-hand corner of the Zoom window, the software that you're seeing me through in the PowerPoint slides. So if you look down toward the bottom right, you'll see a Q&A button, which you can click, and it brings up a small window where you can type in questions that will go to us as hosts and conversation moderators. And we'll keep an eye on those questions as the presentation and Carl's discussion with our guest proceeds. And then at appropriate points in the webinar, we can stop and kind of put those questions into the flow of conversation. So that's how you as participants can engage with us, which we certainly ask for eagerly. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Carl Stauffer.
All right, thank you, Brian. And welcome to everyone who's here. We appreciate all who showed up and taken the time to be with us. And I think we're looking forward to a really excellent conversation this afternoon. It's really a pleasure to have Najla with us, and she'll be presenting in just a few moments, but I wanted to just say a few things before I introduce Najla and her presentation a little bit more, and that is restorative justice is at a place where many of us believe we're either going to move on to the next level. We're at a tipping point, if you will, in the field's growth. It's growing and expanding. The research and the writing is almost breathtaking to try to keep track of. And one of the ways in which RJ is expanding is a new application and a lot of new questions being asked about RJ's ability to address and provide a framework for transformation of whole systems and whole structures and macro level conflicts. And it's exciting to see all over the globe where RJ principles, values, and practices are being applied in areas such as healing historical harms of colonialism, slavery, or other kinds of genocide of indigenous peoples that happened maybe hundreds of years ago, as well as applications to community development, urban violence, and public violence, as well as transitional justice and issues of how do we help countries move from war to peace transitions and have a restorative discussion and set up a transitional justice process that has the lens of restorative justice there. And while I'll be the first to say restorative justice is not a panacea for all justice needs or for all conflict or peace-building issues, I do believe there's great potential. And that restorative justice provides us with a cohesive justice system that isn't based on an inherent violence, and therefore has a lot of potential for a sustainable justice for future generations. And so the folks who are from CJP and know the center here, one of our goals with the Zehr Institute is to have these conversations, these hard conversations, and to say we're not afraid to talk, is RJ applicable in all kinds of crimes, all kinds of harms? And so some people probably don't want to touch some of the territory we'll be going into today, thinking of places like Libya, Iraq, and other places, not that we'll be discussing all of those, we'll be concentrating on Libya. But what do we do in a situation like Libya? And would restorative justice be applicable as Libya struggles to transition in their country right now? And so that's what we're going to be looking at today. And Najla is a second-year student here at the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding. Najla Mangoush is from Libya, and it's been an absolute pleasure to have her here studying with us. She is a professor of criminal law back in her home city of Benghazi in Libya at the Benghazi University. She's a former lawyer, still a lawyer, but a trained lawyer. And she came here on a Fulbright Scholar studying conflict transformation here at EMU, Eastern Maryland University. She has worked with many different organizations, but most notably as a country representative for the United States Institute of Peace in Libya, and has done a lot with women in transition and a lot with nonviolent strategic action in her own country before coming here. What Najla's been focusing her research on while she's here is the possibilities of looking at customary practices in Libya and the potential to use those customary practices in a hybrid model with restorative justice, and see if that wouldn't be a way to begin to deal with local conflicts between families and at a local and community and city context, with the hope that something might grow from that, a network might grow from that, and there would be a possibility that, in fact, this could be applied and pushed up to larger scale across the nation, and particularly as different parts of Libya are struggling with militia groups who are fighting against the Libyan government, and the Libyan government troops involved too. So this is a thorny issue we're going to be talking about, and it's not a place where there's going to be easy answers. But I really am looking forward to the conversation, because Najla has spent quite a bit of time thinking about this for her home country, and what would it mean to put a restorative justice lens into the war to peace transition in Libya. So we're going to turn it over right now, and I'm going to let Najla take it from here. And we're just going to take a few moments to set her screen up, and then we'll be taking it from there. So Najla, it's a real pleasure to have you, and we welcome you here.
Thank you, Carl. It's a pleasure of mine, and I'm so excited to be here with you today to share my research.
Let me just get this screen straight here quickly. Sorry. I think we're in the right place now here. Najla?
Hello, everybody. I'm so happy today, and thank you for participating. And I'm eager to listen to your feedback and your comments and questions about this research. Actually, the idea of the research, as Carol mentioned, like the security issue now in Libya and the conflict between the different militias group has really affected the Libyan society. And from there, the idea of that research is a new vision, is a hybrid approach toward peace. And I'm trying actually to think about how we can integrate the customary justice practices in Libya within the restorative justice principles. And yes, so this is actually the title or the name of the topic. You can see here a picture, and I select this picture for a reason, because I like the way how the traditional leaders who are wearing the white traditional custom, Libyan custom, where they are sitting together in a circle with some legal and political representative in the Libyan government. And I also I love the idea, like there is diversity group, they are sitting together and they have conversation, whereas everybody have the same level of participation in the process. It's look maybe fancy hotel or place, but really what I meant to here indicate in that picture, that process is very accessible. You can have that process, the customary justice, in rural area, in village, in fancy places. Those traditional leaders have actually the access to go and to practice that process in different levels. Also, what we can notice in that picture, there is no youth and there is no women involved in that practice. And this is also maybe one of the challenges or the obstacles that we are going to mention later in the presentation. Overview about the research. We go very fast in the historical context, the potential of conflict transformation, and there is gaps in restorative justice approach to transitional societies, and then how we can combine between the customary justice within the restorative justice, and there is some implementation process, and how I can also monitor and evaluate that process, and finally my vision about that process in Libya. Drawing in the historical context, as people familiar with Libya, the end of the Colonel Gaddafi regime after 42 years, and before we have this colonialism era, where really affect the Libyan society and the violence embedded in the culture. So how we can really be aware about this historical context and try to address that from the peace-building lenses. And then we have also violence embedded in the Libyan society, where the revolution started in 2011, and it was potential for social political change, but within that there is a lot of violence, and there is a cycle of violence continues since that time till today. We have everyday people assassinated and killed for many reasons, and the violence, one of the main reasons for that actually problem. With an actually personal and structural wounds in the society, and with a fragile state, degraded legal system, within all that concept we have, so there is a potential actually to that cycle of violence to be continued. The potential of conflict transformation in Libya. National and international policymakers try to seeking ways to promote the stability and the human security in Libya, and there is many efforts have been done through different international organizations and also local initiatives. But actually, one of the things that we struggle with, we can't actually think about creative way how we can transform that conflict. So my hypothesis is how we transform the conflict in Libya, and by meaning the transforming, how we can actually work with that conflict, how we can recognize that conflict, rather than ignore it or try actually to resolve it by military, so for example, solution, or by violence. So my report argues that restorative justice could be one of the tools that really help the Libyan society to manage and transform the conflict. So rather than ignoring the legacy of Gaddafi regime, which include the customary justice practice, we should think about creative ways in which that can be transformed into restorative relationships that are able to help and heal the society. So one of the things that actually I'm wrestling with and we're struggling with in the restorative justice field, there is actually gaps in restorative justice within the transitional societies. So if we speak about the restorative justice in the US context, there since 1970, they're familiar to work with that concept within the criminal justice, and there is a different understanding how that actually how RJ can work together with the criminal system or the structure here within the US. But actually, there is lack of research and data in the restorative justice as a transformative tool in the transitional societies. Especially in Libya, we have lack of functional criminal justice system and court process today, and there is actually growing need for policymakers and practitioners to approach conflict from a human relational perspective. So how we can do that, and which the ideal way to start with that idea. So I was thinking actually one of the things, how we can combine the customary justice that already practiced by the traditional and religious leaders in Libya, who already exist and accessible and embodied in the Libyan society, how we can work together and how we can really encourage and empower those traditional leaders to be actually facilitator and mediator, have skills to actually deal with the conflict in small level and big level. So we have a strong values actually for interconnected communities in Libya, and how actually we can, this is one of the strengths that we have, and how we can really build on that strength and try actually to encourage this communication and these values. There is also informal programs developed by community groups and civil society. So that's actually one of the potential when you have transitional societies, there is actually potential for change, and there is actually potential for social, political, and economical change. How we can actually use that opportunity and try actually to link between those different programs within the civil society support. So there is too many opportunities actually for RJ or restorative justice in transitional settings. And there is actually, so for example, in democratic levels, there is actually struggling with the restorative justice focus in individuals rather than focus in community as a whole holistic approach. And again, what does community mean? Is that like just the closed circle as a family, as a friend, or as a community? It's a whole community of neighbors and relatives and people who have been involved in that conflict, and how that actually can be opportunity for change, social and political change. Actually, also the restorative justice have a potential to assisting micro and macro community events, and that actually we have different examples and stories in the Libyan context today, where the traditional leaders actually who already practice solve the conflict for many years ago to solve the small scale conflict like murder case or injury or whatever. Even now, today, in the Libyan crisis, there is also other stories emphasize the importance or the role of the traditional leaders within the elite and the political atmosphere, which really give me actually good news. And I was really keen to follow that examples and that stories, and how actually those political leaders can be facilitator and can go from the top to the bottom, and from the bottom to the top, to work with the different levels in the society. So we have this beautiful picture. Actually, it struck me because we still, as a Libyan, even we struggle today, we really respect, and we have this values and this compassion about the traditional leaders. And this actually picture shows one of the political dialogue in Libya. It shows how after this reconciliation process, how after all this meeting and sharing, stories and try actually to find a solution, shows how that, elder was really respected and was acknowledged as a part of the community, can actually help to bring everybody together. Also, combining customary justice with restorative justice can create moral mandates that reflect the community needs, rather than bring actually international or Western perspective to restorative justice, which is okay in some contexts, but sometimes rather than we help the community, we create more conflict because we are not aware about the unique and the context that we have. So if we can empower those traditional leaders and work with them and provide them with skills, we will be able to have healthy relationship, and we'll be able to have actually process where honored and respect everybody. Also, I mentioned that, like making top-down initiatives more culturally appropriate, so that actually also encourage those and give those traditional leaders power actually to be effective and to be, key people who can really bring the peace and can really actually bring the people together. Also, the customary justice can address injustice more effectively within transitional societies. We know also in the Western perspective, there is a struggling with, when you deal with the restorative justice, how you can change the structure of justice, how you can change the system, and that we're wrestling with till today. That doesn't mean we have good criminal system in Libya, but I think actually because we struggle now with the legal system, maybe we have more potential to create that hybrid approach where those customary justice actually can fill the gap and can work side by side with the legal system to create a new mechanism, a new approach with formal and informal justice. And that actually can really help to create foundation, local foundation to, and also raise awareness about the importance of restorative justice as one of the main components to bring the people together in the Libyan society. Especially, we know, like, the restorative justice is about how we can include everybody in the process, and how actually we can have, how we can present the different needs for the victims and the offender and the community, and how we can bring them together. So there's actually potential for integration by this inclusion process and the community support. Before we go to the obstacles and the implementation, I would love to share a small story that I actually heard from one of the traditional leaders in Libya, and his name Sheikh Abdessalam. He's 65 years old, and he's well-respected leader in Benghazi. And actually, it was so interesting to learn and to listen to the process and how those traditional leaders practice actually the customary justice in Libya. So he tried actually to, he recounted later in a murder case, and he tried to explain to me how the steps look like when those traditional leaders try to resolve conflict. And because actually I believe that in this case, processes matter. Because when we really know the details and we follow the process, this will actually help us to identify where is the strength and where is the weakness, and how actually we have a potential or opportunity to integrate those principles. So he mentioned to me about the murder case. He had been intervened lately, and he tell me the first thing the traditional leaders, when they heard about murder case, the first thing the first question come to their mind is, for example, there's two families, the victims and offender families. So the first questions come to their mind. Each family, they try to ask the question about the tribes. So they want to know each family which tribe to belong to. And that's actually answering that question is very important for them, because they want to select leaders who don't represent the victims or the offender cycle. They want to bring leaders who are really neutral, who don't have any relationship with the two parties. After that, the leaders start to have several meetings where they have conversation just between the leaders themselves, have conversation about what is the case and what's the circumstances and how actually we can intervene. After that step, they take actual step by visiting the victim's family. And when they visit the victim family, actually, they go there and they try to visit them for 3 days. As we know, we're familiar in the Libyan context. When somebody die, they grieve for 3 days and welcome the people for 3 days. So actually, they start the process by showing empathy and acknowledgement to their pain, and don't mention anything about the murder case. After that, they actually organize as a social event, which normally take the shape of lunch, big lunch. And then they try to bring sometimes 70 sheep or sometimes worth that number, and come to the families, victims, and organize that lunch and have conversation. After the lunch, they select one of the leaders to be representative and have a speak to the victim's family. And he starts his speech actually with showing deep empathy and acknowledgement to the victim's family. And then after that, he starts actually use some values of the Quran and from the Islam, where they emphasize the importance of forgiveness and reconciliation and what's the meaning of justice. Try to build in that values to have the attention from the victim's family. And then after that, there's nothing will be mentioned about the murder things. And then they continue have the visiting for a week, building trust with those victims' family, and try to have conversation without actually mentioning the murder, after that lunch event. Then after that, after a week, the same traditional leaders come again to the victim's family and ask them for their permission to intervene in the murder case. And in this case, when they take their permission, they go to the offender family, and they brought some solution, to resolve that conflict. And one of the main solutions they often use in the murder case is, asking the offender's family to leave the city where the incident happened. And that sometimes required to leave the city for a year. And through that process, actually, they ask them to leave in any relatives or friends, or sometimes one of the leaders offer to those families to come over and stay next to him. And then when the offender's family agree, then the leaders continue the process, and then they each week start going back to the victim's family and ask them to drop one of the names of the victim's family from the list. So before the half of the year, most of the victim's family return back to the city, and maybe except in the end the father or maybe the offender himself, who's waiting for the justice in that time. So the last process actually, and the last step in that process, come when the traditional leaders offer who called Sulha, and Sulha means in the English language restoration. And then they ask, and they bring like agreement, and they ask the two parties to come and sign that agreement. That agreement include amends, and sometimes it's amount of money, 100,000, and sometimes 100 sheep. And then after that, the offenders, it depends on the murder degree. Sometimes he spent the rest of the period of time in the jail, and sometimes the murder is not required for him to stay in the jail, so he can come out and live in the city again. So actually, I explained that story just to show and try to describe the process of those traditional leaders, and which step and where is the strength and again the weaknesses in that process. The obstacles and the challenges in that process actually a lot. So we can notice in that story there is actually the process of traditional leaders actually is victim oriented. So how we can actually shift the traditional paradigm in restorative justice. We know restorative justice should include three main components: the community, and the offenders include the offender family, and the victim include the victim family. What we can see here or hear about the story, it's actually very victim oriented, where they really focus on the victim's need and try actually to acknowledge their pain, which is perfect. But actually there is, and also they focus on the community level also, where it's very important to reconcile and to restore the relationship between the two families. But actually there is no rule to the offender here in the process. And we know about the restorative justice, we need to hold that offender accountable, and we need to feel the responsibilities, and we need to share stories and empower also the victim. So we have this part where really we're wrestling with now, and we're missing in that process. Also addressing the gender sensitive issues, partnering with the justice initiatives. We don't have women as a respected traditional leaders, and also we don't have participants who are already women in that process. And we know, especially after the revolution in Libya, there is many sensitive issues happen to the women, as a sexual abuse, as and some sensitive also conflict where she's not allowed to share her stories, and she's not allowed actually to be part of that process. So what we can do, how we can include the women in that process as a leader and as participants. The other thing, actually, the very significant, the historical and culture component of trauma cycle. We have a trauma embedded in the Libyan society, during Gaddafi regime, where many assassinations and oppression happens, during all that time, and that continue after the revolution, with the cycle of violence and the fighting and losing people every day. All that actually affects the Libyan society, and the amount of trauma, it's really exists. And how we can actually have leaders who are really sensitive to the trauma and can address the trauma through the process without, bringing harm, rather than try to resolve that problem. The last, obstacle or challenge, the imbalance power through the access of weapons. So normally before, like one of the leaders they're struggling, one of the things he mentioned to me when I interviewed that traditional leaders, we struggle now with the issue of respect. We are not respected like before. We still respected in some point, but actually we're struggling with those militia who holding the weapons now and trying actually to create new dynamics in the society where they actually hurt by using the violence and the weapons, and and how that actually threat the traditional leaders, and also include the religious leaders as well. So how we can wrestle with that, how we can actually try to think about that's a challenge. The implementation process, again, it is, I'm still envisioning that process. I'm still actually thinking about it. And I think one of the things that really I noticed after sharing that story, there is actually a requirement for training for those traditional leaders with support of civil society. And again, from also, as I encourage the legal also professional be part of that process, because actually we need to have inclusion, and we need to have a holistic approach where everybody be part of that process. We need actually to open conversation about the possibility of restorative justice in Libya, and try to highlight the weaknesses in that process and how actually we can encourage and empower those traditional and to solve that obstacles and to go over that obstacles. Definitely after that training, we need those traditional leaders actually to listen to the both sides, rather than have that meeting before and decide what kind of solution they are going to address. They should actually listen to the two parties and try to make assessment about what they want, what justice look like for them, what they need, and try actually to encourage everybody to be part of that process. Also, I feel drawing the religious belief, it will be one of the strength things, and I believe like the Libyan society in general is Muslim societies, where really we grow up as a Muslim and we grow up proud to be Muslim. So I think drawing in that beliefs will really open the conversation about many beautiful values. They can bring the people together rather than divide those people will be ideal. Again, as I mentioned, enabling the offenders to speak and to hold accountable. This is very important aspect from restorative justice, and also allowing victims to share their stories of impact, what happens and how that impacts his life since he had been targeted, and what kind of justice he's looking for. His voice should be heard in the process, rather than again take the solutions of the decision. How we can monitor and evaluate that? There is 6 famous questions have been asked by Howard Zehr, the father of restorative justice, in his little book Restorative Justice. I think we should actually go through that questions when we train those traditional leaders and ask them, does that model address the harms and the needs and the causes for that conflict or no? And try just to think about that and envision that will be actually what I think the first step to acknowledge the importance of restorative justice. It is adequately victim-oriented? Yes, no, how is it? Is it just with victim, with their families? Are offenders encouraged to take responsibilities? I don't think so in the story, but again, we can do that, and how we can do it. Are all relevant stakeholders involved? Again, drawn from the story, no, and that actually what encourage that training should consider. Is there any opportunity for dialogue and participatory decision? Again, I think there is some and some not. There's steps where those traditional leaders actually were individually oriented, they just have the decision, and sometimes they have the conversation, but I think there is some of pressure and the decision have been made through those traditional leaders. The last questions, is the model actually respectful to all parties or no? And we know one of the important things, essential thing in peace building, if really we need to resolve the conflict, which mostly 100% about relationship have been damaged, how we can honor and dignify those people who in the process is really, really essential component. So my vision, as a last thing, actually my overall vision and my dream, how to implement restorative justice principle within the civil society and the legal system as dignifying collaboration, creating consciousness and balance in the society. However, among all these obstacles, there is still an opportunity to bridge the people of Libya and strengthen support around restorative justice as relates to customary justice. So what I'm trying to see, yes, I'm starting with the traditional leaders and religious leaders, but actually my dream, I need to include everybody in the process. I need to actually start the step by educating the people about the RJ, who already, we have a lot of those principles in our culture, in our religious, but how actually we empower everybody, empower those traditional leaders to be actually helpful and healthy mechanism to bring the people together. I think this is the end slide, and then I have the references. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you, Najla. This was a very, very important conversation, and I really appreciate you taking taking the time and the energy to speak to us. And I'm looking and seeing if we've got any answers and questions to all of this. But I'm going to give those who have taken part in the seminar some time to create some of your questions. Feel free to send them, as we have talked about before, through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For those who are participating, you can feel free to put in a question at any point, and we'll be glad to take that on. What I'm going to do until we get some of those questions in a little bit more is continue the conversation with Najla. And so I think what we'll do is we'll pull together here a little bit more and see what we can do for that. Najla, we've got plenty of time for some discussion with our participants, and so I'd be happy to have you say anything more about your own sense of, I mean, you are taking restorative justice into a very difficult situation, potentially. And I know you've talked about what's on the ground actually in Benghazi, and the insecurity and the various militia groups that you've interacted with. I'm wondering if there's any other stories you'd want to share with us about what you think the potential would be for a form of restorative justice to help begin to address some of those issues. Or anything else you'd want to say about how you've come across restorative justice as something that you've seized upon while you're here. I mean, you came and you're getting a degree in peace building, conflict transformation in general, with a concentration here on justice. But what is it about restorative justice from your own personal experience? And there's a lot of that, I know, before you came, that has made you have this hope and this vision that you've just shared, as that there's a possibility for a peaceful transformation of conflicts in your country.
Thank you, Carol. I think this is good questions. What actually give me hopes, again, like first of all, about the restorative justice, actually, I was really attached to that context since we learned about that in Foundation 1 in the class. And maybe because I have justice background, I was really attached to the idea and was really curious about how that can work, especially with places where they're struggling with injustice. But actually, going back to the questions about the story, so one actually with the recent story in the political level with the militia group, actually, it was in March 8th in 2014 when we have his name called Jadran. He's one of the the guard for the oil port in Libya. He decided to control that oil port and try actually to have 4 oil ports under his control with the militia support. And actually, he was during that time tried to use some pressure in the National Congress. And really, I was following that case in the news. And this case actually, it wasn't easy case. It was really bring all the country in very critical stage, where the Prime Minister Ali Zaidan by himself resigned and flee from the country because he wasn't actually able to solve that conflict. The National Congress during that time actually tried to send representatives from the government several times, but there is no actually any potential to solve that problem. The militia refused to listen to the government representative until the government actually, the National Congress, decide to select some of the respectful traditional leaders and send them to the oil port there to have conversation with Jadran and his militia. It took him a month for this conversation, but after that, Jadran was able actually to, give the government back the 4, oil ports. And this was for me a aha moment. Like I was, okay, we have something interesting here. We can really think about it and invest it and try to think about creative way, actually, how we can really work with those traditional leaders as a real mediator, respectful and embedded in the Libyan society to resolve the conflict even in the big level.
So that's fantastic. I mean, we have so much in the media that's looking at what's not going right in Libya and imposed systems of government and military and other things from outside. And here is potential to see great hope for the asset base that's there in Libya, in the culture, and there's still a great respect for traditional leaders and traditional ways of working with conflict and finding solutions without violence in this situation, which is very hopeful and what we don't often hear, here in the news. We've got a question here, Najla, for you. Tribal leaders only play a major role in solving conflicts caused by tribal or regional affiliation. Those leaders' power exists in the countryside and small towns only. How can they play a more decisive role in cities like Tripoli or Benghazi, where tribal affiliation doesn't exist?
It's a very good question, actually, and this is actually what unique about Libyan context. When we compare Libya with Somaliland, for example, where the customary law is very embedded in all the society, Libya actually have a unique, history, where we have actually in the coast, where most of the people live in Benghazi and Tripoli, actually they have, different, let's say, live style, which compared to the desert and the rural area. But the story that actually I mentioned now before about the murder case actually was happening in Benghazi city, which is considered the second city in Libya. And actually the wise part about those traditional leaders, which really I admire, when they decide to intervene in any conflict, they don't bring the traditional leaders who live in the same city. They try actually to bring traditional leaders with other city or with other tribe leaders where they can actually be neutral and can be actually fair, to handle that process without taking a side. So I think the cities here cities in the north and the other places, I think it's not considered obstacles in this case. It's considered more, strategy that those traditional leaders use to be able to be accessible in different places, in different contexts.
I think this is an important question, and we're finding this in other work that we're doing with indigenous practices in transitional justice processes. For instance, some of my work that I've been involved with in Sierra Leone, where they're doing a process called Fambo Talk. These are the same questions, because right now Fambo Talk is spreading very quickly throughout the rural areas and the rural districts and provinces. And some people are asking, will this work in the capital city, in Freetown, where people come and they're from all different ethnic groups, from all different areas. The traditional leaders don't have the same clout, maybe, or prestige in the urban areas. And so this is a challenge. But I think we are as I understand the conversation on the ground, there are many people, even though this appears to be a rural traditional practices seem to be most appropriate in the rural areas, there are many folks that I'm hearing on the ground saying, no, these processes would still be respected in the cities if we would revive them, like what happened here in Benghazi. We might have to be more creative, and it might not be the immediate community of family and clan. It might be another kind of community in the urban area. Maybe those friends and networks who support certain sides are considered the community. But these are some of the questions, we will be wrestling with as we go into this kind of thing. Let me check here. We have a few more questions. Thank you for your great presentation and discussion, Najla. My question regards the implementation of this approach in Benghazi and Libya in general. The fighting during the Libyan uprising, the abundance of weapons, the lack of state institutions, and the support from external patrons appears to have empowered a generation of young fighters that do not seem to respect traditional authorities anymore. How do you envision shielding this process from direct initiatives from men with arms? Thank you.
Thank you, John Luis. He's my friend, and so happy he attended this conversation, and he's also have experience in the Libyan context. I think this is a very good question. I think this is one of the challenges that I'm really thinking about all the time, and as I mentioned, like this Jadran case is actually one of the examples, but actually I don't want to pretend it was successful, process in terms of resolving that conflict. Maybe they were able just to end that crisis, but definitely those militias still holding the weapons, and they still, especially those young people who don't have knowledge, they are not educated enough, and they are actually brainwashed from different agenda and groups, which we really know how those people actually they had influence. I think maybe one of the things that I'm building on, and I think maybe that will help, as you know, also most of the Libyan, they belong to different tribes, groups, for example, include myself, for example, and when it comes to the family issues, when you have like your uncle or your grandfather or your, whatever, who really, consider one of the close relative who can influence, the decision have been made by holding that weapons through those traditional leaders or whatever civil society. I think there is opportunity to have at least conversation about why you're holding the weapon and why you keep fighting. And I think, and here actually the awareness components and, and the technical support for those traditional leaders to have this critical conversation with those militia is actually one of the things that we should keep working on. And this is actually what I'm trying also to discover in my research. I'm not pretending here like I'm having answers, but really I'm trying to encourage myself and people like you to think about how really we can, think about that challenge with weapons hold and with imbalanced power, like I mentioned in my presentations, and how actually we try to start think about what is the appropriate approach for those traditional leaders to start the conversation with those militia groups. We need actually to acknowledge also the trauma, which is the big issues now. Those young who really have they have interest in power and holding weapons, and so I think there is too many dynamics within the process themselves, and I'm really I'm still thinking about that questions. I couldn't find answer, but I'm trying just to be to think with you how we can do that.
Of course, there's a broader discussion about how do we keep the flow of small weapons and arms out of these kinds of regions. That's a very big discussion on its own. Yeah. But let me ask, while we're on this subject, Najla, are there other members or groups of civil society or religious groups that have access to these young militia? You mentioned the traditional leaders having these critical conversations, but I'm wondering if there are other groups that have access to these militia, and how could we encourage them to use their influence with these militia?
Actually, I think there's now I'm really try to encourage the moderate religious leaders who really don't have any also political agenda to be part of this dialogue and to be part of this, try to work with those traditional leaders, because some of those traditional leaders, they're already religious and traditional leaders in the same time. So the story of Abdus-Salam that I mentioned, he's actually religious leaders, and also traditional leaders have been practiced that for several times. But again, I think the role of the civil society is very important. And in Benghazi, actually, there is too many initiatives have been done by individual who actually work with different organization, but because also it's very complicated and difficult conversation, and they don't want to bring the threat into their organization, so they decide to work as individual and to have this conversation individually by one-to-one, rather than put the risk with the organization, especially now where it happens. And I know actually two people, they're youth, and they're really smart enough to start this conversation with two different militia groups and try to speak with them. Why you keep doing that, and how we can stop that violence, and actually it was really useful conversation. It was risky in the beginning. And everything, I think, even in the peace building, we need to have the risk, and we need to be creative sometimes, and we need to think. We don't need to think sometimes about the consequences too much, because in this case we will go, okay, no, we can't do that. I think we need to test some of our ideas, and we need to think about it and just take the initiatives, and nobody knows what's going to happen. And those two young people, they were really, able to have that conversation with those militias.
Yeah. Wonderful. I mean, I think this is exactly right. Our work does mean risks, especially when we look at restorative justice, when we look at trying to address justice in situations where there's overt or direct violence. Let me ask you again, if you don't mind, Najla, to comment a little bit on, you mentioned on a few different points in your presentation, for instance, the picture of the men sitting in a circle discussing, and you said you will notice that there are no women here. How do you, first of all, maybe what do you imagine the role of women in Libya in this process? Is there a role for them, and what would it look like? And then how would you imagine bringing them, grafting them into a restorative justice intervention of this kind, or any kind of peace-building intervention of this kind?
When you say role of women, you mean in the restorative justice or in general?
I think, well, you could answer it from both, but it would be nice to hear if you're imagining a hybrid model, what would that mean? Would there be a way in which we could begin to bring women into the conversation? Would women be able to play a role in helping to bring more peace building in these kinds of groups or not? Yeah,
I think the women actually have a big potential to be a good peace, builder. And I think there is too many initiatives, again, happens in my hometown and in also different cities in Libya, where really the women was able actually to have the conversation and start the dialogue about, the weapons things, or with the militia or whatever. I mean, and also other potential I can see with the women, because the women actually wasn't involved in the fighting. And that actually gives the women, opportunity and chance to be actually more respectful and more be neutral in the process. Because the woman, who's the woman? Is the mother of that fighter who's suffering from his son fighting, the wife, the daughter, the neighbor, the friend, and all that actually interconnected to each other. Now the people actually suffering, like in Benghazi, really the people complain every day. They need actually just to live without violence, and just build on that fact and try to speak on that and try to bring the women together and think how we can start that dialogue. I think it had really a big potential. In terms of the restorative justice, I think it's a still new concept in Libya. And I think the ideal way and how I can vision it, I think if we can start with small training with different groups from civil society, include the women, that actually can build the awareness about that concept, and then encourage the women actually to start that process. Because, awareness is a big issue. I mean, even by myself, without coming here and learning about restorative justice, it will be for me difficult actually to vision that, or, to imagine how that can work in that context. So I think the education part is very important before we ask this woman to be included or no.
I know that there's some work by one of our graduates, Ali Gohar. I don't know if you've heard about his work from Pakistan, and their traditional process, the Jirga meeting, was, of course, well, not of course, but in many situations of indigenous work, it was mostly male-dominated. The males sat in the circle. And as he began to talk about reviving that with a hybrid model of restorative justice, he began to try to emphasize in the community the need to bring as many people to participate in the decision-making, and was somewhat successful as far as I know, and he has written some stuff for those who might be interested in reading more in bringing certain groups and parts of the culture to the place where they were inviting women and youth to be in those circles when they're making decisions around the community. But it would be interesting to know how that process took hold in a traditional society.
No,
of course.
Ali Jawhar really is doing very interesting work, and I think learning from those different contexts and how that restorative justice could be applied. I think this is one of the beautiful things about RJ, how really can work. It's just a framework. You can just design and try to implement those process and try to think about, okay, what's missing here in the picture. So I think exploring that in different contexts, really one of the things I love about restorative justice, because it gives you opportunity to be more creative and also to include your context within that process, And I think this is what Ali Jawhar and there's many students in different places they try to do.
Sure. Najla, I'm wondering, I mean, I think we would all wish and hope and pray for a transition, a peaceful transition in Libya. And there, of course, is global discussion about transitional justice processes. There's been military intervention, as we full well know, the revolution and all of that. And maybe we don't hear a lot about Libya necessarily on the news all the time, but could you comment a little bit about what is the conversation at the national level about a transitional justice? Are they talking about international criminal courts or truth commissions or what? And if they are, how do you imagine this research and your thinking around restorative justice might inform or be connected to that process, if there is?
Yeah. The conversation about transitional justice actually started very soon since the revolution started, I remember, and it was implemented by the National Transitional Council that time. So actually they were thinking about transitional justice mechanism where they can actually deal with many crimes and issue they're struggling with the Libyan context. But I think what was missing from that picture, they just actually issue a law, and that law actually was very dry and was really finance oriented, and in a way he was actually trying to fix any harms have been done by paying a certain amount of money, or try to exchange land by land, or and part of that, yes, transitional justice and maybe even restorative justice, because there's some restoration with it. But what they really ignore in that law, there is no actually conversation about the relationship between the damage have been done with the society, and this is actually one of the things that I really was criticizing about that law. And even after that, like, we have many workshops and seminars about transitional justice, but it was actually more about learning lessons from different contexts and try just to think about it. But there is nothing actually have been done in the reality in the Libyan context to start think about that. And that's why really I was thinking about restorative justice maybe will be one of the key things that can actually work in that context where have been many harm have been done, and there is needs from the victims and from the society and from the community. They are suffering from that violence every day.
Sure. So the sort of idea that if we could get this working on the ground level, there would be some pressure from the bottom up, as opposed to many of the transitional justice mechanisms as they are projected after a war situation or a war to peace transition are sort of from the top down, from the government down, and they don't often trickle down, if you will, to the local level. So somehow we need to keep those connected. And we have still some time for conversation, so I'd welcome any other questions from those who are participating in the seminar, the webinar, to please send through any questions you might have. Let me ask another one while we're waiting if there's any other questions from folk. Part of transitional justice is truth-telling, and you went over very quickly the historical context of Libya, which has a lot of complexity and nuance. But some people, we've heard, in some cultures, maybe it's the fatigue of war, maybe it's a sense of we're not ready, but truth-telling at a national level is too threatening. Do you think there's a possibility to have truth-telling? I mean, 40 years of the Gaddafi regime and all of that, there was a lot of secrecy, there was a lot of silencing, a lot of hiddenness. Is there a place for truth-telling at some point in this process?
It's very good questions, but again, I think from what I have been seeing and noticed as a Libyan, there is too much shame and guilt happened during all that, period, Gaddafi regime, and also continuing the cycle of violence after the revolution. And I think the part of our culture it's so difficult for us to, to comfort ourselves and to make a, like a confession in front of the people. It's not something we grow up in, and I think that maybe will be sometimes challenging, but also it's really will be healthy and will be helpful. Especially we have different level of crimes have been done from the state level to the community level, and I think that will be one of the things that we can think about it. But again, I think from the culture perspective, that will be sometimes tricky, and maybe will be challenging. Those people who involved offenders and the communities. But I think, try to practice that, and maybe open many opportunities or doors where the people, they will be encouraged to be part of that process.
And of course, the central part of restorative justice is relationship and trust, but also being able to tell the story.
Exactly.
To how much do you think, in situation like what you're describing here, let's say in the current violence with the militia and stuff, how much are the people involved, the stakeholders, the actors, both the militia, the government folks, the community affected by the violence, how much of their story would they tell from the history? In other words, would they talk about the current violence because of the history, or would they separate those?
I think big part of the Libyan now and what's happening now on the ground, they blame Gaddafi all the time by actually cultivate that culture where the violence embedded. Where actually Gaddafi, one of the things actually he did during his era, he actually create division within the society by actually bring people who not well educated from rural places where they don't have any source of knowledge or power, and try to give them everything, and actually disempower the people who are well educated and who have knowledge actually to fight for their rights.
Sure.
So that division actually continue till today. And I think now even the post-revolutionary people, they start actually continue doing the same policy they have been made by the Gaddafi regime. So there's some sort of the same kind of division happens today by those people who have been supported Gaddafi before, eliminated and excluded. And I'm not saying here they should not be, bring to the justice system, but some of those people, they were just supported, So why we can't include those people to be part? So this mentality of no, we don't want to work with those people or have conversation with those people actually affect the process today. So I think we should, go back to the history as we learned here and try to analyze that context and try to think about, okay, where that division come from? It doesn't come today. It's really a long history of division and discrimination. It takes different shapes and different names, but actually in the end, it's just the same idea. We include who believe in us and we exclude who not believe in us. Even we have one religious and we don't have any divisions with different ethnic group, we have actually potential to be a unity country. But again, within that actually colonization and that long term of dictatorship actually affect the people, how they think and how they act.
This is very interesting. I wonder if you would want to comment just a little bit. I mean, it's related to this on the truth-telling, but how would we, if there is going to be in this restorative justice process, you're asking people to remember, and how do we keep the revenge? I mean, I think you've explained some really important processes traditionally, and we see the power in those, and I think you've established that in your mind, the traditional leaders play a very important bridging role. Do you think, where do you think the Libyan culture right now is in the sense of being receptive to restorative justice? Or is there still a lot of, is a lot of the violence being motivated by revenge? And how would we curb that with the restorative justice process?
I need to write a paper about that question. I don't know. I mean, it is, I mean, we know when we have conflict, we have opportunities and we have risks also. And I think that also part of what we're thinking about now, because but one of the things really I loved Bathway, one of those professors in Australia University, who was the first person think about restorative justice in Libya. And he was like, he writes actually very short article.
John Braithwaite?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So one of the things that struck me when he say, where is the violence embedded? Where is the high risk of violence is a cure in the process? Where is restorative justice is needed?
Right.
And I think that actually was for me something opened my mind. Yeah, because I was thinking all the time, no, I can't implement restorative justice because, for example, here in the US, we have security, you know, we have actually stability, so we can't have that conversation without risk, you know. We just want to deal with the system or even with the people needs. But I think there is a risk by those people who hold the weapons and by that violence still keep going on, but also there is potential because we don't know. Maybe that conversation will break the cycle. And maybe those leaders, within the power they already have and with the trained and the basic training they got with the civil society support and the legal support, they're going actually to make change. And again, we don't know when is the right moment. And this is again one of the things that we wrestle with. Sometimes it will be now, later, I don't know. And my hope for that research, it just encouraged the policymakers and the practitioner and the organization who are interested to work in Libya, just open the conversation about it and think together how really we can implement that and just be honest about what the challenge we have and what's also the opportunity we can build on. And that, I think, encouraged me to continue that.
Sure.
That.
That's a lovely challenge and a lovely reminder. I mean, it's a challenging one. It's difficult, but I do recall, yes, Braithwaite's work and him saying very clearly in his work in Libya, you know, that in fact, restorative justice is not worth its salt. I'm paraphrasing now. If it can't be taken into those very places where violence is direct and seemingly destructive or is destructive, and seemingly maybe chaotic, that restorative justice needs to be there.
Exactly.
And that it has a power. The restorative justice process has a power through relational transformation and trust and just changing the expected response to violence, to a non-violence, that it can actually transform these conflicts. It can change the rules of the game, so to speak. And I think that's what encourages us. And you've left us with that very hopeful message, Najla. Maybe Najla, you would say a little bit, if you will, about where you see going from here. Would you like to build on this research? What are some of your dreams and thoughts about where this path of restorative justice and this research might take you?
I think I will continue working that research because really I'm very interested and actually also curious to see the result. So this presentation actually built on my first research about the idea of how we can integrate those two different components, the restorative justice and customary justice in Libya. But actually what I'm going to do for my practicum research, for my graduation, I'm just going to do research, just focus on the process of those traditional leaders. So I'm not going to think about restorative justice. I'm not going to think actually about literature from the customary justice. I'm just going to actually interview many traditional and religious leaders and have conversation with them and think of, and ask some critical questions about the process and just envision that and collect data and information what can really build on. My hope maybe that will be my PhD research where I can have data I can actually use and go for further research about the implementation, how it's looked like. Because again, as I mentioned in the beginning, process for me, especially in that research, is matter. Actually, each single details in the process will open conversation and could be opportunities or challenge. So and that's why I'm curious about learning more about from those traditions and try to envision that and analyze that context, and then try to think about, okay, what's next? How we can use that and how we can really work forward to implement the research for long-term process.
It sounds like very exciting, almost an action research. You're going back to the core, the origin, the voice of the traditional leaders, and working on it from there. And I think it'll be a mutual process, because you'll be educating them on RJ, if you will, while you're having a discussion about what this might look like in the country at this time. So we really wish you all the best in that work and research and where that takes you. Looking forward to staying tuned to how that opens up new conversations in Libya, and believing that it's in fact these small seeds that sometimes really bring the fruit. And I never say never. So I'm looking forward to, with expectation, hearing media and news from Libya that there's this process on the ground that's helping people reconcile or helping people restore justice and heal in Libya. And I'm confident that can happen. It has happened in places of severe violence in the past, and I think there's a lot of potential for that in Libya also. So thank you very much again. And some people may be interested in a paper and you have prepared a paper on this presentation. We hope that paper will be available within the next few days. Actually, probably after the Thanksgiving holiday, it will be up on our website for those who are taking part in the webinar and might be interested. So the podcast will go up, as well as we will make Najla's paper available to those who might be interested in reading more on this. I'm going to take one more look. It looks like we don't have any other questions coming in. Fabrice, I'm going to ask you to pick up from here and talk through a little bit more from CJP. So I'm turning it over to you.
All right. Pulling up the PowerPoint. All right. Some of the programs, the last seminar of the semester is Restorative Justice by Design and Barb Toes. And wait 2 seconds. Barb Toes will be and Dan Van Buren will be looking into what is architect and what does architecture work directly with RJ and the actual space where the processes are actually being taken. So what does that role? So you definitely do not want to miss that one, because I think that's a very interesting space that's really pushing the envelope into restorative justice and the actual context of it within the design architecture. Some of the programs that are at EMU is we have an undergraduate program in peace building development. We also have graduate programs in conflict transformation. There's Eastern Mennonite Seminary, Summer Peace Building Institute, and STAR, and we're gonna kind of peer into some of them more closely. If you're interested in building skills and building more knowledge into RJ, the Summer Peace Building Institute is providing training for people that are really trying to get into the nitty-gritty of RJ and really trying to understand the theory and practice behind these things. So RJ, Restorative Justice, the Promise, the Challenge, and Lorraine Stutzman and Michelle will be teaching that class. Developing Restorative Organization, Dave Brubaker and Single Shoham will be also teaching that class. Justice and Transition, Restorative Indigenous Practice in a Post-War Context. Carl will be teaching more on what does justice look like and transitional justice frameworks. And if you could, you can find more information at emu.edu online for that. So definitely, this is a 1-week intensive SPI, and we have people from all over the world that attend these things. So I highly recommend that you check it out or spread the word about these things. STARS, Strategies for Trauma, Awareness, and Resilience, which this is a phenomenal program that goes into what trauma is and how trauma impacts systems, people, and how does it impact us as practitioners in the field. So I highly recommend also looking, because STAR has been something for me in my life that has opened so many like new doors into understanding what trauma is, and how as a practitioner can I like better understand these things while I'm in the field. We have 2 STAR level 1 trainings are going to be taking place in February 2 to 6 in Harrisonburg, and May 25th to June 2nd in Harrisonburg. This is next year. And if you want more information, please visit the website as usual. This is going to be posted online. We've done the STAR program in many different places around the world. We did it at USIP, United States Institute of Peace, a couple weeks ago. We've done it in South Sudan. So this is a very, very great program if you really want to learn about trauma and really get inside track on that. So the master's program I'm currently in, it's practice-based, and there's different processes of focus that you can focus. RJ, from psychosocial trauma, strategic peace building, organizational leadership, all these really, the program in conflict transformation is really the cutting edge into understanding these theories and really expanding your awareness in the education. I know Najla talked about how she was not able to really to conceive what RJ was until she got like to an academic setting that allowed her to really understand what these things are. And I think this is what the master's in conflict transformation really provides. It expands your mind, and really you build up these skills in your education and awareness. So definitely check it out and spread the word about the master's in conflict transformation. We have something brand new this semester, the RJ graduate certificate. And this is something that I highly recommend also, because this is strategically focused into RJ, and you could really understand what this is. More intensive than SPI. So if you have more time and more space and you really want to go into RJ in the field, then this is the graduate certificate to go into. And all this is information, as kind of said, is found online. So I recommend you guys checking it out. You will find it online there. So this is the final presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Fabrice, and thank you all of you who have joined us for this webinar. I just want to say a few things by way of concluding. You know, Najla, first of all, we want to thank you very much, and I want to invite you to give any last words if you'd like to, or final comments or thoughts.
Actually, I want to end with hope, and I'm still hoping with all that dilemma and all the sad news I'm receiving every day. Actually, that's what I'm wrestling with as a peace builder and as a part of my country, Libya, which I'm proud to be. And I just vision that every day and hear that bad news really actually make me disappointed sometimes. But again, I think part of the challenge, how really to encourage myself and my colleagues who are interested to work in Libya. And I think there's too many potential and opportunities to work with the Libyan context if really we know exactly how we can start and how we can understand that context. Maybe the last word will be there is many local and international reconciliation process have been taking place in the Libya during the 2 years ago, and I think most of them have been failed. And one of the reasons I think to have that unsuccessful process, I think part of it because the reconciliation process doesn't take a long time, just for short time, just few meetings with elite who represent specific groups and not include everybody in the process. And I think if really we need to have reconciliation through that mechanism, restorative justice, or even without it, we need actually to be honest about who's coming to the table. We need to include everybody: militia, Gaddafi, post-revolutionary, civil society, women, youth, traditional and religious leaders. Everybody have been impacted from that conflict, should be part of that conversation. And also we need to be patient, and that process need more time. And also we need to think about these barriers we create as isolation law that have been issued. Some of that language we used by naming or calling the people who supported or not supported that group of people, because actually the language and the dignity actually aspect by, try to ignore those people or say, no, they're not important to be part of the process. I think this is one of the things that really we need to acknowledge, to think about healthy process where everybody included. And that maybe open the conversation about healthy also restorative justice can really imply in post-conflict area, which included Libya.
Thank you, Najla. This has been really important. And I just want to say, I mean, your final remarks are reminding us again that this is going to have to be something that is owned by the local people. It needs to build within that context in order for it to be successful. And I think we've spent a lot of time and a lot of resources imposing from the outside, and it's time, which is what excites me about Najla's journey into restorative justice, that we find those from within the context who are heralding and carrying the torch for restorative justice. So thank you for doing that. And in many ways, Najla, what you are saying is the narrative needs to be changed. And you found a new language here, a new narrative around restorative justice that you're carrying forward. And in the process of implementing restorative justice on the ground in Libya, as we say from a social constructivist view, the narrative that we speak is what constructs our preferred realities. And I think you're building a new narrative which we believe will catch on. And when many others find it, it will construct a preferred reality of justice and peace in Libya. So we wish you all the best in your work and in your efforts, and especially as you imagine rewriting this history and this narrative in a way that provides a hope for the next generation, for your own children and their children. Thank you, everyone who joined us for this time, and we're going to close out now and encourage you to be back with us again for the webinar on December 10th. All the best, and go well this evening. Thank you.